Supreme Court shockwaves over Oregon ban. Gun owners across the United States just witnessed a turning point that could redefine the future of firearm rights. In Oregon, a sweeping magazine ban and permit-to-purchase law have collided with constitutional limits. After being ruled unconstitutional in a landmark trial court decision, the case is now headed for the Oregon Supreme Court, and the stakes could not be higher. If the decision is upheld, it could dismantle magazine bans in other states. If it fails, it could give governments a green light to bypass constitutional protections in the name of public safety. This is not just about Oregon. This is about the very foundation of the right to bear arms in America. So, if you believe in the Constitution and your right to stay informed, now is the time to act. Subscribe, like, and join the growing movement of citizens standing for freedom. At Firearms Law Advisor, we break down every legal detail so you know exactly what's coming. Chapter 1. Magazine ban crumbles in Oregon court. The fight began with Measure 114, a controversial piece of legislation that introduced two sweeping firearm restrictions: a statewide magazine ban and a permit-to-purchase requirement for all gun buyers. These laws were immediately met with fierce legal resistance, culminating in the Arnold v. Koch lawsuit. The law banned the sale, purchase, and possession of magazines holding more than 10 rounds. It required a government-issued permit before any firearm could be purchased. Plaintiffs argued the measure violated Oregon's state constitution. Judge Robert Rashio ruled the entire measure invalid and issued a permanent injunction. This ruling was a major milestone. It declared that the state's attempt to restrict firearm access went beyond its constitutional limits. The judge emphasized that such restrictions had no historical precedent and could not be justified under the Oregon Constitution's protections for the right to bear arms. However, the legal battle was only beginning. Chapter 2. Court of Appeals sides with the state. After suffering defeat at the trial level, the state of Oregon appealed the ruling to the Court of Appeals. In a surprising decision, the appellate judges reversed the injunction and upheld Measure 114. Their reasoning sparked outrage among Second Amendment supporters. The Court of Appeals concluded that Measure 114 was facially constitutional. They emphasized that the law could be applied in some circumstances without violating rights. The court leaned on a subjective interpretation of public safety interests. Expert testimony from the lower court was largely dismissed. This reversal felt like a political decision to many observers. Rather than strictly applying constitutional standards, the court appeared to balance rights against hypothetical harms. Their conclusion was that limiting magazine capacity and requiring permits was acceptable as long as it was done in a reasonable way. But critics warned this approach dangerously eroded fundamental freedoms. Chapter 3. Supreme Court steps into the fight. With Oregon's highest court now accepting the case, the battle has reached a decisive stage. The Oregon Supreme Court has scheduled oral arguments for November 6th, and legal experts across the country are closely watching how this could influence similar laws in states like California, New York, and New Jersey. The case, Arnold v. Koch, challenges Measure 114 under Oregon's constitution. The court will weigh both the magazine ban and the permit-to-purchase requirement. Oral arguments will provide insight into how justices may ultimately rule. If the court upholds the lower ruling, it will block enforcement statewide. This stage is critical. Unlike lower courts, the Oregon Supreme Court sets binding precedent within the state. And because the measure impacts fundamental rights, its decision could also be reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court, especially if it conflicts with federal interpretations of the Second Amendment. The outcome could ripple across the nation. Chapter 4. How Measure 114 Violates the Constitution. At the core of the case is the claim that Measure 114 restricts arms that are clearly protected under the Oregon Constitution. Plaintiffs argue that limiting access to standard magazines and adding bureaucratic hurdles to firearm purchases violates both the spirit and the text of state law. Oregon's Constitution, Article 1, Section 27, explicitly protects the right to bear arms. Magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds are standard for most modern firearms. The Supreme Court has already recognized these as protected arms under the federal Constitution. Historical records from Oregon show no precedent for this kind of restriction. The plaintiffs also contend that the law fails the historical test established by Bruin, which requires that any restriction on gun rights be rooted in long-standing tradition. By banning something widely used and not previously restricted, Measure 114 fails that test. The court must now decide whether to preserve that originalist standard or rewrite the rules. Chapter 5. Oregon's Flawed Two-Step Test. Unlike federal courts, Oregon applies a unique two-step analysis to gun laws, and critics say this approach is manipulated to favor government control. This test weighs public interest against individual rights. a dangerous game when fundamental freedoms are on the line. Phase 1. The court asks if Article 1, Section 27 even applies to the regulated item. Phase 2. If yes, they apply a balancing test between public interest and constitutional rights. The court considers potential harms and whether the law serves the public good. This allows hypothetical fears to override hard legal protections. The danger here is clear. If judges are allowed to dilute rights in the name of safety, there is no limit to how far they can go. Plaintiffs argue that this test must be rejected in favor of strict historical scrutiny. Otherwise, the government could justify nearly any restriction by claiming it promotes public safety, even without evidence. Chapter 6. The appeals court flips the ruling. The victory in the trial court didn't last long. The state of Oregon quickly appealed Judge Rashio's decision, and the Oregon Court of Appeals reversed the permanent injunction. The appeals court sided with the state and reinstated the magazine ban and permit system, arguing that the law was still constitutional under state standards. The Oregon Court of Appeals overruled the lower court, found that Measure 114 is facially valid. The law has constitutional applications, prioritized public safety over the trial court's findings. The appeals court essentially brushed aside the previous findings and gave the state a second wind. But this move was not the end. It triggered the next and most important stage: review by the state's highest court. Chapter 7. The state Supreme Court steps in. With the lower courts divided, the Oregon State Supreme Court has now stepped in. The justices agreed to hear the case and scheduled oral arguments for November 6th. This marks a major escalation. What happens in that courtroom will set the tone for gun laws in Oregon, and possibly beyond. The case is now titled Arnold v. Koch. Set for oral arguments on November 6th, focuses on both the magazine ban and permit law. The challenge is based on the Oregon State Constitution. This stage is crucial because the court will weigh not just policy concerns, but how deeply the law cuts into the right to keep and bear arms. And depending on how they rule, it could open the door to even bigger fights at the national level. Chapter 8. A fight over history. At the heart of this case lies a question much bigger than magazine limits. It's a question of history itself. Oregon's Constitution, written in 1859, holds the key to whether today's gun restrictions are even legal, and the plaintiffs are arguing that the state is completely ignoring that foundation. The plaintiffs say no historical precedent exists before 1859 that allowed bans on common firearm components like magazines. Oregon courts are supposed to use historical analogs to test the legality of gun laws under the state constitution. Experts say the state failed to provide any valid historical comparison to justify banning standard capacity magazines. Instead, the Court of Appeals used a modern reasonableness test, which critics argue violates settled law and constitutional principles. This isn't just about a policy choice, it's about legal integrity. If a state can rewrite history to justify limits on fundamental rights, then no constitutional protection is truly safe. That's what this challenge is exposing, and that's why it matters to every American watching. Chapter 9. Supreme Court Watch begins. The stakes just got higher, not just for Oregon, but for the entire country. With the state's Supreme Court now reviewing the Arnold v. Koch case, a much bigger constitutional question is looming in the background. The U.S. Supreme Court is closely observing what's unfolding, and legal experts believe this case is primed to become part of a larger national fight. A federal case from California challenging a similar magazine ban is already knocking on the door of the U.S. Supreme Court. If Oregon's highest court rules in favor of gun owners, it would set up a powerful precedent for the federal court to consider. A dual challenge from both Oregon and California would corner the federal justices into finally weighing in on these bans. Experts say this could be the most direct opportunity for the U.S. Supreme Court to declare magazine bans unconstitutional nationwide. This is not just about one state anymore, it's about whether the Second Amendment can be limited by states in the name of public safety, or whether core firearm rights must remain untouched regardless of local politics. The stage is being set for a definitive ruling, and everyone knows it. Chapter 10. What happens next? With oral arguments scheduled for November 6th in the Oregon State Supreme Court, everything now comes down to how the justices frame their questions, interpret history, and apply the state's constitution. But no matter which way they rule, the fight will not stop there. If the court strikes down Measure 114, it would be a massive victory for gun owners, reaffirming that arbitrary limits on magazine capacity violate constitutional rights. If the court upholds the ban, plaintiffs are likely to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, potentially fast-tracking a nationwide ruling. The decision will also directly influence other states with similar laws, including New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. Oregon's case could become the foundation for either restoring rights across the country or expanding restrictions depending on the outcome. The clock is ticking, and this legal battle could soon reshape the national conversation around magazine bans and firearm permits. Whether you live in Oregon or anywhere else in America, what happens in this courtroom will affect your rights in real time. Get ready for a legal turning point that may determine the future of the Second Amendment itself. The nation is watching. This case is no longer just about Oregon. It's about the future of your rights, your firearms, and your freedom. With the Supreme Court now paying close attention and states across the country waiting to see what happens next, we are standing at a legal crossroads. Subscribe to Firearms Law Advisor for expert breakdowns and real-time updates on the most critical cases in the country. Hit that like button to boost this message across the community, and let us know in the comments, do you think magazine bans will be gone for good? History is being written in that courtroom, and every single one of us has a role to play in what comes next.